Welcome to this video. I am Mark, and in this video, I'm going to talk about the new config automation features that have been introduced with Airlock 8.4. The video is structured as follows. After a short overview, I'm going to show you how to convert from XML to YAML, and then look into the YAML config format. After that, in Chapter 4, I show you how to manipulate YAML config files from the command line or in a script. Then I'm introducing the concept of snippets, first by showing how to use snippets, then by showing how to create snippets. Last but not least, we'll have a look at the config API deal. The video has chapter markers that allow you to directly jump to the single chapters. If you're familiar with Airlock IAM, and if you're using 8.3 or older, then you know it's not too easy to automate configuration. There is just the XML configuration format, which hasn't been designed for automated or manual adaptation. It's basically an internal format that is used by the config editor. With Airlock 8.4, we wanted to change that. Our ambition with the new features are we want to empower customers to implement configuration automation with Airlock IAM seamlessly. We want to enable the integration of Airlock IAM into existing configuration automation toolsets and pipelines. This means we're not going to tell you exactly how to do config automation, but we're going to provide some tools, some CLIs, some new concepts that allows you to integrate it into your existing config automation pipelines. With Airlock 8.4, there are the first few features around config automation. And of course, it won't be the last. So we want to continuously improve by learning from you, from our customers and our partners. And we also really estimate if you give us feedback. So what are the new features about? So very shortly, it's about three things. It's about a new config format. It's a YAML-based format for manual and automated config manipulation. It's about the concept of snippets. They allow to modularize complex configurations. And it's about new CLI commands around config composition and validation. In this part of the video, I'm going to show you how to convert from XML to YAML. This is done in three simple steps. First, you have to make sure that your configuration to be converted is already on version 8.4. If not, you have to use the config migration tool as usual. Then I'm going to show you how to convert a single configuration file using the new IAM config convert CLI command. And finally, you have to tell the IAM instance that it's going to use YAML and not XML as a config format. So let's do this. Here you see my terminal, and I'm inside an IAM installation. So you see here the instance directory, and there is an instance called auth, as in the default installation, and within that instance, there's the normal Medusa XML configuration. I'm going to show you how to convert this instance from XML to YAML. So use the new CLI command config convert. Let's see the usage message. So we just go through that here above. That's the command. There's a possibility to convert an instance, and there's also a possibility to convert a single file. So I'm going to use the instance variant here. It's going to find the right configuration file, Medusa XML, and transform it to a new YAML file. Let's do that. I'm specifying the instance auth here, but by the way, I could also omit this part because there's just one instance and then it would pick automatically the right one. Let's do it this way, it's more clear. So what it does, it reads the XML file of the instance auth, and it writes the YAML file to file IAM-config.yaml. That's the new name for the configuration file of an instance. So actually, we're all set now, but there's one more thing you might want to do. As you probably know, there is a folder working copy, and it stores all the previously saved or activated configurations with whatever you entered in the activation field. So you can use this in the config editor to go back to an older configuration. As you see here, this is all in XML, and the new IAM instance on YAML will only read YAML files. So if you want to preserve this file, if you want to be able to use them from the config editor, you would have to convert them using the CLI I just showed you. As a next and last step, I'm going to tell the IAM instance that it should work on the YAML file and no longer on the XML file. I do this using an application parameter in the instance properties file. So there is a new application parameter called IAM.config.format, and I just changed this from XML to YAML. Note that it's a new parameter, so if you're editing an existing file, it may not contain it, and you have to add it. So this is basically it. Because we changed an application parameter, we have to restart IAM, and after that, it will work on the YAML file and no longer on the XML file. Next, let's look a bit closer at the new YAML config format. Before going into examples, I would like to show you where you find information in the documentation. So here is the 8.4 documentation. Go to the configuration management chapter, and within that to the config automation chapter. And there's a page about the YAML config format specs. So it should give you all the information about the config format in detail, also all the special cases using context environments and so on. We're not going into that in the example. So, but now let's look at a concrete example. So what you see here is the configuration that we just converted from XML to YAML. It's not too simple configuration. It's quite large. So it's really a working configuration with password authentication and password administration and a lot of self-services and so on. But we don't have to look at the whole configuration, just at the single parts. So just to give you a bit of an overview, there's a schema version, which denotes the version of this config format itself. Then there's a type. It's a IAM config. You will see later in the video that there's also another type, IAM snippets. And then there's some metadata about the configuration, like the version and the history of the configuration. Then the actual configuration starts here after the spec attribute. And to look at that a little bit closer, we're going to look at a simple and a single plugin in YAML. So I copied here a very simple plugin. It's a password policy plugin, and would like to show you what all these attributes are about. So to make sure you understand what we're looking at, let's look at the very same plugin in the configuration. It's within the password settings here. So we're looking at this simple password policy plugin with some properties here, some more properties here. As you might know from XML, we only see the properties that are not on the default value. So if you see a D here, for example, or an empty property here, it won't be in the YAML file. So let's switch to my editor. So such a plugin is represented like that in YAML. Let's start with the type. The type defines the plugin type, so which plugin class to really use. Note that here you see a fully qualified class name. This will no longer be the same in the next IAM version. It will be something very short like this to make it stable across releases. Please read the corresponding information in the documentation about that. So you can use this fully qualified name, and you will also be able to use this in the following releases. There's no need to change things, but from 8.5 and later on, we only have simple names, which is a lot more readable and also easier to manipulate. Then there's an ID. An ID is a technical identifier that uniquely identifies this very plugin within a configuration. This ID is a UUID, but very important, it doesn't have to be. It can also be something very meaningful. So I could also write down here, for example, my simple password policy. So I will come to that a bit later, why this is important. Then there's the display name. So it's the name that is displayed in the config editor, for example, in the tree or wherever you are about to select this configuration. So let's go back to the config editor for a second. You also see the display name here. It has always been around in the XML file under the name identifier. And what is new in the config editor, you can also see and also edit the identifier. So if you want to use meaningful identifiers, a little bit to that later, you can also change them here or directly in the YAML file. Then there's the properties attribute followed by the properties of this plugin. So these are the values that really configure this plugin. Now let's move on to a more complex configuration. In this simple password policy plugin, there's only simple properties like true and false and digits and numbers. In this next plugin, it's a bit more complicated. There are also plugins that are values of properties of another plugin, so forming little plugin trees. What you see here is the whole password settings plugin. Let's again look at the config editor so you know what I mean. So we are looking at this plugin. So it's a plugin with a lot of simple properties, but also with plugins that are property values. So I'm not going to explain this here again. And here we have some simple properties. And here is a first property, and its value is another plugin, namely the extended string generator. As you see here, the plugin extended string generator goes down to here. It's directly written here as a value. So you can really preserve the hierarchical structure in the configuration file. This has many advantages, for example, when diffing files, or it's also easier to understand. So the rest of the plugin is exactly the same as before, but you may have guessed it's not always possible to write down a plugin directly within its containing plugin. This is the case, for example, down here, when a password policy plugin is referred to multiple times. So I don't want to write down the password policy configuration twice, because then I would have to manage the redundancy. So what you see here is instead of writing down a plugin, I can also just refer to it by using its ID. So the password policy plugin is defined elsewhere, and it's referred to here by this reference. Now that you know how to represent a simple plugin in YAML and to represent plugin hierarchies or plugin trees and how to refer to other plugins, we can go back to the whole configuration and again have a look at the bigger picture. So again, what you see here is a whole IAM configuration with login app configuration, database configuration, admin app, service container, and so on. To give you an overview over the high level things, how they are put together, we can use my ID, which has a neat feature. It knows how to display YAML, and I can also collapse whole YAML trees. So what you see in the spec part of the configuration, here's the actual configuration. The first thing is the global configuration plugin. It's the main settings, as you see here in the config editor. So it's just a different name for that. If I collapse the whole mail settings, I see the login up. It's the next one here in the config editor, and so on. So that's how the whole configuration is organized. First, there are all the main module configuration routes like login app, admin app, service container. There could be transaction approval, API policy service. So, and then there's one more plugin here. I added an unconnected plugin. So this is a plugin that's just lying around in the configuration and it's not connected to anything else. So they are just added at the bottom after the module trees like login app and admin app. So that's it. You've seen most of the YAML format. It's really straightforward. What I haven't shown you is how to represent lists of plugins, how to represent maps of plugins, but it's really not that difficult. You can find that also in the documentation mentioned here. It's all written down here. And all the advanced configuration concepts also, they are documented here, or you can just try them out in the config editor, download the file and look at the YAML. When I say advanced configuration management concepts, I refer to config contexts, configuration environments, configuration variables, and inheritance. Let's now see how to manipulate such YAML files. By manipulating, I don't mean clicking in the config editor, but using some CLI tools or scripts to manipulate configuration files. This is essential for config automation. So to do this, let us first find a real simple example and just look at the config editor so to see what I am about to do. I'm again in the password settings, and as a simple example, I would just like to do in a script or the command line, I would like to uncheck this box here. New passwords must be changed. This is something when I'm testing, it's always annoying when I create a new user or create a new password, then I have to change it. What I want to do is that I can use a new password and then don't have to change it for testing. It's easier. So to find out what to do in YAML to do that, there's several ways to find that out. One simple way is you just look at the configuration and then change the thing in the config editor and then look at the configuration again. So let's do this. We have the configuration here with the box checked. It's also default value, so there won't be any property in the configuration about that at all. Let's store this and say, let's call that before for the change. And then let's uncheck the box and save it again after the change. So then I go to my ID, and in the instance directory, in the working copies, there should now be these two working copies I made. Let's diff them to find out what happened. So up here on the right side, you see the new configuration and the old configuration on the left side. You see the comment I just entered. Let's ignore that. It's not very interesting. And down here, I should see the change. So within plugin password settings, in the properties, I added a new property with the name new passwords must be changed and set that to false. So we have to remember that when doing that on the command line, or I just leave this ID here open so we can use it afterwards. So that's one way to find out what to do. It's especially useful if you're not yet familiar with YAML and how to do this. And there's also another way to do that, or actually it's two ways. We could also go to the config editor and use the config editor documentation. Where is it? Here. Click on it. And then here you see the property name, how it's spelled for the configuration file. And there's one more thing to say. You can also go to the documentation and you will find a link down here to something called plugin config reference. Open that. And in this file, you find all the plugins that there are in the product, and you can look up all the property names and so on. Please don't worry about this. It's just because I'm doing the video before the release has actually been released. So let's look for the password settings plugin. It's here. Click on it. And then here you see all the properties documented. So we should find the right property. And here is a small YAML template. And we can also find the property here and also see what the default value is. So with all this information, we should be able to do this change in the command line. So let's get to the IDE and again have a look at the configuration we're about to manipulate. It's the one here. I'm copying it to my root directory. Call it working YAML so we don't mess up with the actual configuration. So it's here. What do we want to do? We want to go and find the password settings plugin. It's in the global configuration, the main settings here. We want to find that. So we could, for example, look for this ID, the configuration, and then once found, we want to go to its properties and then add the property we just found out is missing. So the one which says new passwords have to be changed. I have to set that to false. So let's do the first part in the shell, just in shell. So you could put that then in a script, for example. So to find this plugin here, there's several ways to go there. We could just follow the path of JSON, like spec dot, and then the first or the one with index 0, then go to properties and so on. This would work, but it's probably not a good idea because it's probably unstable if the password settings object would move around or if it was an object that could be anywhere in the configuration. So I prefer to look and find it by the ID. So this ID is pretty cryptic. So when I don't want to use it in a script, so because then I don't know what's going on. So I would like to rename that, just making sure it's used only once here. So I just call that password settings or something like that. So I can refer to that in the shell script and it does something meaningful. So let's go to the command line and let's do that. To do that, I'm using a tool called YQ. Just give me a second. Here. So YQ is a very powerful tool to process and examine YAML files. You can use any other tool. You can even use set for simple stuff, but YQ has proven to be a good choice for that. So you can just download that for free and install it and then use that. So what we're going to do is we're using the command YQ, and then we're using dot dot. What dot dot does is it goes down all the hierarchy of the YAML file. So if I just do that on the working YAML, it will show me every node in the configuration file. That's great because I want to use that for searching. And what I'm doing is the following. Let's copy this here. So I'm telling it go through the whole file. This is the dot dot in YAML. Then pipe that into a select, which is actually a selection or a search. Look at all the nodes that have a type argument. It's the plugins that have a type argument. And then within that, I want the one with the password settings ID. Let's try that. So it will output for me the password set. It will find this plugin with ID password settings and output that for me. So to access this node in YAML, or the password settings plugin, I don't want its contents, but I want the path to it. So then I can use another YQ command to set the property to that path. And this has proven to work like the following. Let me come back here. So it's exactly the same, but I pipe the result into path. The path operator, it will give me the path. And instead of writing down the path as an array, I join the array and put dots between it. So it will output something like that. So I found the path to the password settings plugin using YQ. So again, we're here. It will go to spec, and then in the first element, it will go to the properties within that, to the element password settings. Then we are here. Okay. Now let's use that path and set the property we want to set. Also prepare that here. Now it's again the same. Apologize. Give me a second. So here is the right command. So what I want to do is use YQ, and then I'm using this path again. Within the path, I want to go to the properties element and then set the new property to false. Apply that on the working YAML, and then the -i here means just change it within the file and don't output the result. So let's do that. So we should be able to go to our IDE again. And here we are on the working YAML, so it should have automatically changed now. Let's find the password settings again here. And then we have all the properties here. Password policy, voila, here it is. So let's see if it really works and copy the result, working copies, working YAML to the instance configuration file. This should automatically activate it, and we should be able to reload this. Yeah, now the config tells us that it has the configuration has changed, and you have to reload it. So reload it. Let's go and check it, and voila, the property has been set and activated. To sum up what I did with the YQ tool here again on the slide. So I used YQ. You can download this from GitHub, for example. And the first thing I did was to find the path to a plugin within the YAML file, given its ID. So this was done like using the dot dot operator of YQ. It will recursively go through all the plugins in the hierarchy, in the tree. And then from that, we select the YAML node which has a type and which has an ID, and the ID is equal to password settings. So this will give me the YAML part of the plugin with ID password settings. From that, I want the path, which will return an array of path elements, and I join that to a simple string using the join operator. Then, using another YQ command, I set a property within that plugin. So using YQ, I use the path, we just find out and add whatever is needed to go to the right property, and then just say equals value. This will add a value if it's missing or change a value if it's already there. So this has been pretty easy because we just manipulated a simple property. But what about more complex stuff like this one? Like we have a plugin called inner, and we want to connect this plugin to a plugin property of a plugin called outer. To do that, there's a config CLI in IAM, which is called IAM Config Connect plugin. And we could do what I just said by specifying the source. It's the ID inner, the source plugin, the target plugin or destination plugin minus the outer. And then we have to specify to what plugin property to add the plugin. So make a bit more concrete example. If we had a plugin with ID protdb, which could contain, for example, all the credentials to connect to a productive database, and this connect, we would connect this to plugin end user persister in property SQL data source. There are similar commands for plugin lists and plugin maps. So let's have a look at these config connect plugins. If using the IAM CLI, just type config connect, IAM config connect, and you will see that there are different subcommands. One to connect a plugin to a plugin property, one to add a plugin to a list of plugin properties, and one to add a plugin to a plugin map. So let's try that out with the simple command that just connects a plugin to a plugin property. So to do that, let's look at the configuration, the config editor. Again, in the password settings, there's the property password policy. Again, when testing, I like to disable the password policy so I can use any password like 1234 for testing. So I want to get rid of this simple password policy and replace it by some null password policy. I already added such a plugin, null password policy, to the list of unconnected plugins. I called it no op password policy. I put that in my clipboard so I don't have to type it afterwards. So what I actually want to do on the command line tool or in a script is do this, just connect this. That's what I want to do, but not by clicking, but using code. So let's undo this. Again, that you see it's the simple password policy here. So what do I have to know? I have to know where to connect it. It's the plugin with ID password settings. I have to know the ID of the new plugin. It's in my clipboard now. And I have to know the property name of password policy. Let's see. It's password policy. So it should be pretty easy. IAM config connect plugin, then tell it in what file to do that. It's in my instance of IAM config YAML. So I'm doing it directly in the running configuration. It should directly be auto activated then. Then my source plugin is the no ops password policy plugin. I put that in the destination plugin, which is password settings. And the property is called password policy. So if I didn't mistype anything, then it should theoretically work. And it looks like it did. There's no error. So if I click here, config editor informs me, hey, the configuration has changed on the file. Please reload it. And we should go to the password settings, and voila, here it is. So what I did is I connected a plugin that was already in the configuration. To see how to put or import new plugins or a new lists or trees of plugins into the configuration on the command line, you have to watch the chapter about snippets. Now let's look at config snippets. So what is an IAM config snippet? A snippet is any part of an IAM configuration put in a separate file. This can be a single plugin, a list of plugins, a single plugin tree, or also a whole list of plugin trees. A snippet looks like a normal IAM configuration, except for the type, which in this case is IAM snippet and not IAM config. We will have a look into a simple and then a more complex example in a minute. Snippets allow you to modularize complex configurations. That means split complex configurations into single parts that can be easily managed and put together again to form whole configurations. Both the config editor and the IAM CLI support snippets, as you will see in the examples afterwards. Examples are target application templates, second factor plugins, float templates, OpenID Connect clients or OpenID Connect servers, and so on. So it's completely up to you what to put in a snippet and how to put snippets together to form a whole configuration. Let's look at a simple example. Here you see a very simple snippet. It's a snippet that contains only one plugin. As in the whole configuration, there is a header, there's a metadata, and as mentioned, the type of this is IAM snippet and no longer IAM config. It contains, in the spec part, it contains one single plugin. In this case, it's again a simple password policy with the ID strong password policy. We have to remember that for the script afterwards, and with some properties making that password policy really annoying. So what can we do with this snippet? We can, for example, just drag it into the config editor, like this. And the config editor will ask us what to do. There are two options. We could open the snippet and edit the snippet. I'm not going to do that because it's a very simple snippet. There's nothing to edit. And we can also import it into the configuration that is already open in the config editor. When doing so, there are several other options. Now, assume you import a snippet into an existing configuration. There could be two problems. First of all, there could be ID collisions. So as you know, IDs must be unique within a configuration. So if the snippet contains an ID that's already present in the configuration, that would be a problem. So you might, if to avoid this, you might add a suffix that is appended to all plugins IDs of the imported configuration. The same is with the display names. They also have to be unique for legacy reasons. And you could also ask the importer to rename display names if there are conflicts. We don't have to do any of these options. We don't have to use them because the imported plugin does not produce collisions. So let's just load it. So it says successfully loaded, but nothing happened in the configuration because the snippet was just imported. So we will find it in the list of unconnected plugins here. If we want to use this plugin, we have to connect it manually. Let's go to the password settings and the password policy plugin. So there it is, a strong and annoying password policy. We connect it and then we're done. Now let's do the same, but on the command line in the terminal. The snippet we are going to import into the configuration, it's here in my configs directory. It's called strong password policy snippet. Let's copy that into the clipboard so I don't have to type it. To import a snippet into a configuration, you can also do that several times. We use the new CLI command IAM config import snippet. So let's look at it. So as you have seen in the other CLI commands like IAM config connect plugin, there are several options. You can specify an instance to import the snippet into. It will then automatically import it into the configuration file in the right location with the right name, or you can just use it to import the snippet into a file. Then you have all the options around conflict resolution and so on, but we're just using it very simply using the -i option to specify the instance. So let's do that. IAM config import snippet into our instance with the name of, and then we have to specify the snippet name like that. Let's try that. So that looks good. It's imported into the configuration. So if you go to the config editor, let's click on it. It will warn me that the configuration changed and I have to reload it. So it should be here among the imported snippets. Okay, now let's go on and connect the snippet as you connect the new password policy plugin as seen in a previous chapter in the movie. So it's using IAM config connect plugin. Source plugin is called strong password policy. The destination plugin is password settings. Let's get that right. And the property to put it in is called password policy. And we do that on the file or on instance auth. Huh? Voila, it looks good. Let's see again in the config editor. Config has changed, so reload it. It should be connected here now, as you see. Strong and annoying password policy. So that's it. So if you do that, you can imagine you can connect a lot of plugins, import a lot of snippets and put it together. It can be quite complex. So it's always a good idea to validate the configuration before deploying it. And for that, there's also a new config CLI. It's called IAM config validate. So again, it's with a lot of options. I use the same here again, using our instance and not the file. Let's just try it out. So this will validate the whole configuration just as the config editor does. So it does not just look at the syntax of the YAML, but it really looks at the semantic if it forms a valid configuration that could be activated. Let's look at a more complex snippet example. What you see here is a snippet that contains everything you need to use FIDO passkey authentication. So it's not just one plugin as in the previous simple example, but it's plugin trees, lots of plugins in a snippet. So let's first import that into the base configuration using the config editor, and then later we'll do that in a shell script. So let's just take the FIDO and drop it on the configuration. Select import, load it. So what has happened, all the plugin trees from the snippet have been added to this configuration, and now they are in the configuration, but unconnected. So you see a lot of plugins all about FIDO, passkeys. Some of them are not valid because they're missing links to somewhere or missing mandatory properties. That's okay, that's by design. And the original config, it has not been altered in any way. So to understand what we're doing, we have to look a little bit into the base configuration. So this base configuration is a complete configuration with login app, admin app, and service container, but just with password authentication. So, for example, there are no second factors or no strong authentication factors configured. In the login app and the demo application, there's just one flow with username and password. And in the admin app, their user management, there is just a password token controller. So that's the one to manage passwords in the admin app. So we imported all the FIDO plugins. We didn't have to create them all. This would have been a lot of work, but now we have to connect it. So let's do that. So let's go to the authentication settings and connect the FIDO settings that we have imported from the snippets. Now the configuration gets invalid because there's something within the FIDO settings that needs to be connected, and it's the data repository, the database repository. So in the snippet, it doesn't make sense to configure the SQL data source because that's something you usually have in your base configuration. So let's connect the one from the base configuration, and the config is valid again. So now we already have valid and working FIDO settings to start with. Let's go to the default application and change the flow. Now, it's just an easy case here. I just want to switch from username password to FIDO authentication. Just choose the flow that has been made available from the snippet. In a more elaborate FIDO passkey snippet, there could be lots of different FIDO flows. For example, usernameless and some username password and FIDO. Here I chose just one with entering the username, then doing FIDO. So that should be all that's needed to authenticate then. Let's go to the user management in the admin app and add the FIDO token controller that came with the snippet. So we are now able to manage FIDO tokens in the admin app. So that's basically it. Like that, you could use it, but let's go one step further. Let's add some self-services so the user can also register FIDO keys and delete them. Now, this is part of the protected self-services. First, we have to enable the credential list so the end user can manage registered FIDO credentials. It's also available here from the snippet. And then we also want to add two self-service flows, one for registering FIDO keys. Now you see here there have been added a lot of FIDO flows to the configuration because we imported the snippet. One is for registering, and the other one is for removing. So I won't configure stuff like disable, enable FIDO, or rename FIDO credentials. So just for this demonstration, that should be enough. So we have that. And we also want to have that in the web UI. We have to configure that separately from the REST API configuration. So go to the UI configuration, protected self-service, again, add the registration UI, and add the removal UI, and then also add the UI for the FIDO credential list. So that's it. So this was pretty easy, and we selected ourselves what we want to have and what we don't want to have from the FIDO world. And we didn't have to create any plugins. We didn't have to create any plugin trees or do complicated stuff. So it just fits neatly together. We can activate this and then we're all set for using Fido. So this have been quite a lot of manual steps to connect stuff, but we can also do this in the terminal or in a script, and that's what I'm going to show you next. Let's do that in a shell script instead of the terminal, because it's going to be a few config connect and snippet import command. So to do that, I prepared a shell script here. So what it does is it takes the base configuration, that's the configuration we had in the beginning with just the password stuff in it, and then copies it to a working config YAML. And then we're going to work on that working.yaml file. And when we're done, we're going to activate the configuration by copying it to the target config YAML file. So this is just the definitions of the files, then copy the source config to the work config, so the base configuration, so we can work on that. Then first of all, we're going to import the snippet into that work file. The snippet is again the same. We already did that before, nothing special. And then we have to start connecting stuff. So here I already put the first connect command. Let's see how I found out how to write this down. So up to here, it's going to be the same or almost the same for all connect commands. It's just say, please connect something, do that in the working file, and here is the interesting stuff. So to find out what to do step by step, I just have here the config editor open with the base configuration. I'm going to drag and drop the Fido snippet, say let's import it, and then I have all stuff here in. I'm just going to do this for the first connect, and it's the same for all the rest. So what I want to do is first I want to connect the Fido settings that has been imported from the snippet to the main authentication settings. So I'll do that. And then I can copy the IDs I need. So the source plugin is the one I just connected. Let's go there, copy the ID, paste it here, source. Then let's go back to where I connected the plugin. The ID is main authentication settings, and the properties name is Fido settings. Again, you can also use the plugin reference to do that, but it's probably easier in the config editor. So the plugin reference, show you again, you can find it in the config automation chapter, in the using YAML, or also in the snippet chapter. There's a link at the bottom to the plugin docs. Open that. Let's look for the main authentication settings. That's here. And here you will also find, for example, the Fido settings, and you see the property name Fido settings, for example. So we have this, and this will import the snippet and do the first connect. And then we have to do the same with all the remaining connects that you want to make. So to do all the connects that I showed before in the config editor, I have prepared them here in this shell script. So we thought up to here, then going to connect the database stuff. We're going to replace the flow in the demo application. Then let's add the Fido token controller to the list of token controllers in the admin app. Here you see I used the connect to list plugin because the target property here is actually a list of plugins and not a plugin property. Then enable all the self-services. And that's basically it. But then because it was quite complex, let's do a validation of the working config before applying it. I did that here. And this piece of code, it just makes sure that the script fails with a status code of 1 if the validation failed. If the validation succeeded, then we activate the config by just moving the working config, the one that you just produced, to the target config. This will automatically activate the configuration. So let's run that script. That's this one. And we'll go through all these steps and connect stuff. While it's doing that, I can also hint you to the documentation again in the chapter config management, subchapter config automation. There is also a page about snippets, and it tells you what a snippet is, how it's created, how it's used, and so on. In the last chapter of this video, or the second last chapter of this video actually, I'm going to show you how to create such a quite complex snippet as the FIDO passkey snippet. So the script went through, there were no errors, so let's just to make sure it really worked, go back to the config editor, and the config editor tells us, well, the activation has changed because it has been replaced by the just generated configuration. So let's reload the configuration. We have a valid configuration. Let's just do a few checks. The FIDO settings are in there. Let's go to the demo application. The FIDO flow is connected there automatically. Let's see some protected self-service flows. So the self-service flows has been added. So this is an example to show how in a not too complex script that took me like 10 minutes to create with some experience, you can completely automate the introduction of FIDO into an existing configuration, just as an example, but you can do this with any plugins, with whatever you want. You can put together your configuration dynamically based on snippets. It doesn't have to be one, it can be many snippets and based on some connect commands. To sum up this example, let's look at this from a more conceptual view again. So using the tools you saw, like the import snippets, the CLIs, and also the YKey examples, what you could do is the following. You could imagine we have a config repository, for example, a Git repository with base configurations and snippets and code snippets in it. We have a deployment pipeline. Then the deployment pipeline would probably check out the base configuration and then add some snippets using snippets from the config repository tool. Import them using the snippet import CLI, then check out some code that sticks together all the plugins and manipulates the resulting configuration. Then you would probably validate the configuration before actually deploying it to some IAM. Now let's move on to the next chapter, which is about creating snippets. Here I'm going to show you how to create a very simple snippet that can be done in several ways, and then how to create a snippet like the FIDO snippet we saw before using the config editor. Very simple snippets like this one you saw earlier. It contains only one plugin, a simple password policy. It can be done manually or using the config editor. Let me show you how to do that manually. So I prepared an empty file here, and we're going to create the snippet in here. So let's switch to the documentation, to the snippet documentation, and scroll down until you get the snippet template section. Here there are two snippet templates. One is a minimal one without any meta information, and here is a more complete one with one history entry where you could put in the author's name and some comment what it is about. I'm choosing the simpler one. just paste it in here. So we have a valid snippet start, and down here in the spec part, I have to add the list of plugins or plugins trees. So to add the simple password policy I want to have in the snippet, I go to the plugin reference. Again, you can find a link to that in the snippet chapter at the bottom and also in the using YAML chapter. Already opened it here. I'm going to find my plugin. It's called Simple Password Policy. I'll either search it or find it like that. It's somewhere here. Simple Password Policy. So here you find all the information you need. You find the type name, which will be a short name in the next IAM version. You find all the properties with the descriptions, and at the bottom of the plugin description, you also have a YAML template that we're going to use. So let's copy that and paste that in here. Now, this doesn't look like a valid YAML because the specification, it has to be a list of plugins. So let's do some indentation here and add a list element. So now we are done. We already have a valid snippet. Of course, I would go here and add some sensible ID, so I can refer to that in a script, for example, choose a display name and comment if I want to, or just leave that away. It's not really needed. And then for all the properties I want to define a value for, I define this value, and then I'm done. The values you see here, these are default values. So this just indicates if you don't specify this max allowed length, for example, it will be 100. So it's easier to create a snippet when you know that. So that was the manual way to do it, but actually it's a lot easier to do this using the config editor. So here we're in the config editor, and we are on the base configuration. And just to add one single plugin and then use it in a snippet is pretty straightforward. You just create a new unconnected plugin. Let's call it my new password policy. Choose the type. Create it. Maybe choose a sensible ID. Do some configuration if required. And then just download the configuration. Now in my download folder, and I'm dragging it here in here. So I have this configuration now here. And at the very bottom of the configuration, I see the unconnected plugin. Here is my simple password policy. Just copying that and pasting it into my snippet template. And here we are. It's very easy. Now let's create a more complex snippet. I'm going to show you how I created this FIDO passkey snippet of the previous chapter. So this is a snippet with like over 40 plugins in it, and they are forming trees, they are connected to each other, and they are connected or are to be connected with plugins from the base configurations. So you definitely don't want to do this by hand. It's possible, but it's for sure not the best way to do it. So let me show you how I did that. So let's start again with an empty file. And again, as in the simple snippet, I'm going to the documentation, find the template, copy it, paste it here, maybe give it some more information. All FIDO plugins you need. And then here would go the list of the plugins or the list of the plugin trees. We're going to do this using with the help of the config editor. So let's go to the config editor. So it is a good thing to just prepare and test everything you want to have in the snippet in the config editor. So what I already did is I opened the base configuration, which is the configuration without the FIDO stuff in it. It's just the password stuff in it. Then I configured all the FIDO stuff in the config editor, like you saw it before. So there's already the FIDO settings in there. The flow is already on FIDO and so on. So I configured everything here and I tested it. So I went to the admin app, I tested it, I registered the FIDO key, I logged in with it and so on, how you would do it when adding some features to configuration. So it's all in here now. Now what I'm going to do to extract the FIDO stuff is that I'm going to unconnect all the FIDO stuff. So let's do this. Let's unconnect the FIDO settings. Then we have something about FIDO in the user persistor here. By the way, if you're not sure how to find it, you can also use the search function here. Look for FIDO plugins. Then we have the flow. I want to unconnect the whole flow. It's here, or go back to password, for example. Then we have all the self-service stuff that I added. Now, if you added stuff yourself, you're also going to find stuff to remove. If you want to make it easier, you can also use the comment feature when adding the stuff before testing it, so you can also find everything again to remove. So let's do that. And we have some UI settings as well, here and here and here, and in the portal I also added a link to the FIDO self-services. So that's everything here, and then in the user management I have the FIDO stuff here. So that's it. So again, the idea of this is take the base configuration, configure whatever you want to have in the snippet, connect it, test it to make sure everything's all right. And then what I just did is unconnect everything. So it's all in that you want to have in the snippet, because then, as you will see, it's easy to find in the configuration file. And we're just doing that, just downloading it. So I have it in my download folder. I'll drag the file onto my IDE. So here is the configuration that we have open in the config editor. Now let's find the unconnected plugin parts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse all the root modules like main settings and the login app and the admin app and the service container. And now from here on are all my unconnected FIDO plugins. So let's just copy them, paste them in here, and we have a FIDO snippet. So at least we have a list of FIDO plugins and FIDO plugin trees. But it's not yet done. If we save this snippet, and if we either drag it to the config editor, or I'm going to do this on the terminal, if we validate it, we're going to see that there are some things wrong, because some links of the FIDO plugins, they point to stuff in the base configuration. For example, the SQL data source is in the base configuration, and it's referred to from the snippet, which is not valid. So to find all this, what we call dangling references, it's easiest to use the validate CLI. IAM config validate on this file, which is configs my FIDO snippet. So it will show you that there are invalid references, just one here. That's nice. So let's look for that. I copied its ID, find it in here. So here we have a reference that points to something that is not in the snippet. So the snippet is not valid in itself. So here I have to decide what to do. There are two options. Either I'm just removing this, which I believe is correct in this case, because I don't want to have the SQL data source in the snippet. It's something from the base config that I want to refer to, and it's not part of the snippet. I don't want this redundancy, and I want to be able to use this snippet in many different base configurations. So let's just remove it. The alternative way to treat this problem is I could have inlined the configuration. So I could have copied the database configuration in here to make the snippet valid. So sometimes one solution is the correct one, sometimes the other one is the correct one. There's no general recipe for this. So now let's save. Let's do the validation again. By the way, if there would have been a lot of dangling references, then you would get them, all of them together. So you don't have to run the validation command every time. So you get a list. The list was just consisting of one dangling reference. Now you see that there's a lot of validation errors, but when looking at them, they're actually okay because the snippet in itself is not a valid thing, but it's all valid little trees. So you could also take this snippet and drag it to the config editor, and then you would get the same information. So now we're already done with the snippet. It's done. It hasn't been that complicated, but it was also not a too complicated example. You may have examples where you have 20 dangling references, and some of them you have just to remove, and others you have to inline. But that's basically how you create the snippet. If we go back to the documentation, the snippet config documentation within the config management chapter, there is also a section about creating snippets with the config editor, and it shows you step by step what we just did. And it will also tell you some more details about some corner cases, like if you are using inheritance and stuff like that. But you can go through this list and create your snippets. Of course, you can also copy together snippets by just taking the plugin list from one snippet and add it to the plugin list of another snippet. So you can also create complex and large snippets from smaller snippets, but I would suggest that you leave them in smaller parts and then reconnect them by using the IAM config import snippet CLI. The last chapter in this video is about what I call the API deal. So what we've done so far in the video is I suggested that you use the config automation feature, which involves referring to property names, to plugin type names, to plugin IDs, and so on. So if you write a lot of code based on this, and you have to also maintain this code, and you probably want to be sure that we don't change everything in every minor release. So this is what I call the API deal, and I'll show you what the deal with Airlock IAM 8.4 is. So the scope of the deal, what it affects, is the YAML format itself, then plugin type names, property names, and property values. So what we will guarantee is what we call a limited backwards compatibility. So there will be changes within minor releases, but the changes to property names, property values, and so on are minimized. That means we're not going to change anything unless it has a real good value and there's a good reason to change it. And most important, changes are going to be documented. So in the beginning, with the next release, in the release notes, you will find a section about any changes done to the configuration API. So what you will have to do when you update from, let's say, from 8.4 to 8.5, You will have to look at these changes. Hopefully the list is very small or empty. And then you have to decide for yourself whether you have to apply these changes to some of your scripts or not. Note that the configuration files themselves, this includes also the snippets, they can be automatically migrated using the migration tools as it has always been in the last IAM versions. But we cannot automatically migrate your scripts, pipelines, or whatever code that includes property names and so on. So you have to expect that there's something to do, but if you keep most of the information in snippets and in main configurations, then this will be done for you using the migration tool. The deal is only valid for YAML, it's not for XML, and it's for minor releases. If we change something in a major release, we're also going to document that. So at the end of the video, I just want to hint again at the documentation. You can find it in chapter about config management, within that in the chapter about config automation. And also again, note the plugin reference, which is linked in the documentation. And then keep in mind, Airlock IAM 8.4 is the first release with config automation features. So not everything will be perfect. Please provide us feedback and help us to make things better.